Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here and wonderful to have you all with us tonight. Tonight, we enthusiastically welcome distinguished foreign affairs journalist, analyst, and prolific author, Robin Wright, as well as our exceptional moderator, Larry Mantle. Thank you both for being with us tonight, and thank you to our audience for always coming back next week and each week. Next week on February 8th, we will welcome Congressman Adam Schiff to bring his perspective on the new Congress. He will be in conversation with Warren Olney. The title of the program, A New Year, A New Congress. Then the week after, on February 15th, we will welcome the always interesting senior editor of The Atlantic, David Frum, to discuss politics and extremism. Is cowardice contagious? Now that's a good question. He will be in conversation with the always probing and dynamic Pat Morrison. We always have recordings of all of our programs. So if you missed one or want to go back and listen again, or if you want to recommend one or all of our 140 plus programs to a friend, in every single email that David or I send, we include a link to past events. You can also just Google America at a Crossroads on YouTube to find our programs. We have a YouTube station, but just go to YouTube and put in America at a Crossroads. And if you're looking for a particular speaker, you can search. Our programs are also offered as podcasts, and you can find the links at our website or in any of our emails. And just a reminder, we have closed captioning. The problem if you're not hearing well is usually on your end because we monitor, and if there's a problem on our end, we can fix it. Just a brief note, this week, Jews celebrate Tu B'Shvat, often called the Festival of Trees or the New Year of the Trees. Tu B'Shvat marks the end of the harvest cycle and the beginning of a new transitional phase in nature's cycle. So as we work to impact our democracy in positive ways, this is a special time to be grateful for the cycle of our natural environment and to recognize our responsibility to protect it. Now, my friend and colleague, David Lair, for a few more announcements.
Thank you, Janice. Good evening, everyone. For regulars of America at a Crossroads, the past month has been a bit like a graduate seminar in foreign policy taught by experts. From the New York Times' David Brooks, to Stanford's Larry Diamond, Claremont's Mixon Pei, to two diplomatic superstars, Dennis Ross and Stanford's Mike McCall. Tonight, we end our foreign policy focus, at least for a bit, with another star, Robin Wright. If you Google Robin Wright in Iran, you get tens of thousands of hits on that website. She has lots to share with us. She'll be introduced in just a minute. In 3 weeks, after the folks that Janice just talked about, we will host Washington Post columnist Jennifer Rubin, the most prolific op-ed columnist in the country. Jennifer will help us celebrate the 3rd anniversary of America at a Crossroads. She was our first guest in the COVID spring of 2020. The following week, we'll have two of the smartest political analysts around, the Bulwark's Sarah Longwell and the former head of the Republican National Committee, Michael Steele. Both are deservedly media favorites, and both are well equipped to discuss the future of the Republican Party and conservatism. Now, my good friend and a public radio institution, the incomparable Larry Mantle, the man who can discuss films or sports, foreign policy or police abuse with equal expertise, ease, and nuance. Larry?
Thank you, David and Janice, Mel, and Zev. I appreciate it so much. It's always a pleasure to be with you for America at a Crossroads, talking with the superb guests that we have every week. And I've been privileged to be part of some of the foreign policy conversations that we've had recently, and to be back tonight with Robin Wright is a tremendous treat. Our focus, of course, is Iran tonight, where 4 months of protests followed the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini in the custody of the morality police. Hundreds have been killed and thousands more arrested as the government cracked down with reported advice from the Russian government. Nevertheless, Iranians have taken tremendous risks to call for the end of the theocratic government. With us to detail the condition of the Iranian regime and prospects for its fall is acclaimed foreign affairs analyst and author Robin Wright. She's reported from more than 140 countries for a multitude of newspapers and magazines. She's been a fellow at many prestigious universities and think tanks. Her books received notable status and include Rock the Casbah, Rage and Rebellion Across the Islamic World, published in 2011. She's a columnist for The New Yorker, where she's been writing since 1988. Robin, it's so good to have you with us to talk about Iran and, of course, Russia by extension here. Thank you for being with us this evening.
I'm delighted, and I have to say your timing is quite extraordinary because today is the anniversary of the day Ayatollah Khomeini returned from 14 years in exile to begin what they call the 10 Days of Dawn that marked the culmination of a revolution that ousted a system of government that had been in power for 2,500 years.
There's been extraordinary timing on so many of these events. I'm not surprised to hear you say that. Serendipity has been sort of built into this series. Well, following Iran's draconian crackdown, the protests are reportedly fewer now in January, and as we start February, and the protests smaller. To what extent has the government crackdown, the trials, the executions, the arrests, what effect has that had on this movement?
Well, first of all, just to establish, this was one of the most important counter-revolutions of our time. And what's historic about it, it is the first one in human history that was triggered and led and largely participated by women. The young women, the teenagers and young women in Iran have challenged theocratic rule, a system of government that has survived international sanctions and pressure from not just countries in the West, but countries in the region as well. So you are right that the pace and the scope of the protest has diminished. One reason is the draconian crackdown. The executions, the first ones marked last month, in December, I keep forgetting we're in February. And the more than 18,000 have been arrested, 500 have died. So the government crackdown has been part of it. But it's also, I think, a function of a very bitter winter, that the weather has made it much harder to get out and protest, to mobilize people. It's dark this time of year. Communications have been affected because the government has cut off the internet. So a lot of the kids don't have access to VPNs or social media to say, let's get out at this point or that. And there's also a shortage of fuel. And so people are cold. And there is beginning to be kind of disgruntlement and protests evolving because of people are just cold and not getting access to the basics. So I think it's a combination of factors, but don't make any mistake. The anger, the fury at the regime is still as deep as it was on day one.
And you're bringing up the economic conditions in Iran, and I wonder how much of that, not just the cold, but overall the huge rate of inflation they're dealing with, shortages. When you're kind of in survival mode, that may take precedence over taking to the streets to overturn the government. Is that also a factor here?
I think the economic component is really important. And last year, the basic commodities surged by 68%. That's just an extraordinary rate of inflation. Basic foods increased by 48%. So we're talking about costs at a time that the value of the rial has plummeted. When I first went to Iran in the 1970s, during the monarchy, the US dollar bought 70 rials. Today, it buys 470,000 rials. So when we talk about the currency plummeting, it's just it's just staggering. And so for just over half the population now living in poverty, this issue of daily existence is a real challenge. What we forget is that the revolution happened 44 years ago, in part because the Shah had built up enough of a middle class that people could afford the hardships during 14 months of uprisings, 14 months of unrest. Today, that's much harder.
I wonder about this protest versus, say, the Green Movement that we had, gosh, what's it been, 14, 15 years ago, and whether this one, as you said, led by women, but embraced across the country, whether this brought in a wider variety of social strata than we saw in previous protest movements in Iran.
So the 2009 Green Movement was ignited because of a belief, widespread held belief, that the presidential election was fraudulent, that the vote was tallied in a matter of hours, many of it, handwritten votes, and there was a sense that the favored candidates, the popular candidates, had lost, and that, if you remember, a man named Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was reelected, and millions of people turned out on the streets in formal parades in cities across all 31 provinces. And they had banners, and they were organized, and they had a sense of who their leaders were, and the two of the failed presidential candidates. All of Iran's presidential elections have more than two candidates, sometimes dozens registered to run. It's usually whittled down to between 4 and 6. And so there was much more of a formal agenda, a formal structure. And the ones today are being led by a much younger group, less organized, more informal. They don't have a leadership. They don't, you haven't seen the kind of national movement, even though the protests have been nationwide. And they've involved probably hundreds of thousands, maybe millions. It's very hard to tell because we only see snippets on social media. So there's a very difference. And one of the important things is also the demographics. Today, the Gen Zers who were behind the protests make up only 20% of the population. And in 2009, you saw a lot of the activists were the product of Iran's baby boom. And if you'll allow me just to tell you a funny anecdote, after the revolution, the mullahs called on Iranians to breed an Islamic generation, and they really did. The average family in the 1980s had 6 children, and the regime finally recognized that it could not feed, clothe, house, educate, and provide jobs for those numbers. And so it introduced a family planning program that went nationwide. Everything was free: condoms, Norplan, IUDs, vasectomies, tubal ligation. 35,000 women went door to door preaching the benefits of family planning, both for the health of the family, but also to provide resources for defense of the nation. And they brought the population rate down to under replacement, less than 2 children per family. But what that meant was, for a decade, you had a generation that mushroomed. Iran, after 1 decade, went from 34 million people to 62 million. And so you see a baby boom. It was the largest in the world that really dominated society. Today, the protests are being led by the children of the baby boomers. And what we've all been waiting for is to see if the baby boomers, the parents, the grandparents of the young women, will get out and join them. Some have, but not in the numbers yet that would bring down the regime.
Here we see among Gen Z in the United States, certainly in Europe, that this generation is the least religious. They're not religiously affiliated in very large numbers. Is that something we're seeing in Iran, even though it's a smaller cohort, but less religious and therefore less tolerant of theocracy?
It's a really good question, Larry. And I think the answer is yes, but I think that's been true for quite a while. I always make a point when I go to Iran to go to Friday prayers to get a sense of who goes, what's the age range. And usually it's the elderly, very elderly. And I think one of the interesting things is, if you did a survey of Iran, I bet pretty good money that you'd find that it is one of the most secular countries in the Islamic world, one of the most secular in the Middle East. There is a disillusionment with the system. The clerics promised to create a utopia on earth and to help the oppressed, and yet vast numbers are worse off today than they were under the Shah. So, this is where the rule of thumb is that if a dictatorship can keep 30% of the population, that it can stay in power. And the real question today is whether Iran could get that 30%. And I'm not sure it could.
Also, as you mentioned, women really precipitated the protests. And my understanding is that far fewer women wear hijab in Iran since the protests began. And I wonder about gender relations in the country and to what extent men are supporting this, on board with this, versus men who are if not supporting the theocracy and the clerics fully, at least hold to a view that women should be subject to different laws than men.
Well, I think there's a diversity of opinion. You're talking about a country with 85 million people. And I think that there are those who support the system. I think that there are also incredible numbers who think that personal freedoms should be a personal choice, not dictated by the state. And another little story to illustrate why the regime is in such trouble. It set itself up because during the Shah's era, many traditional families wouldn't allow their girls to go beyond the 6th grade because they didn't trust the monarchy to protect their girls against, prostitution and gambling and Western mores. After the revolution, many traditional families did allow their girls to go not only through high school, but into higher education. And over 60% of the student body now, for many, many years, across all the universities in Iran, have been female. And you see, Iran has had a female vice president. It had large numbers of women in parliament. One of its women activist lawyer won the Nobel Peace Prize. A filmmaker has won multiple awards at Cannes. That its women are incredibly dynamic. And when you educate women, it's really inviting them to be active members of society, of government. They vote. And so, as I said, the theocracy in many ways set itself up for failure by empowering so many women and not giving them the personal freedoms they wanted.
I just want to remind our viewers that you can leave a question for Robin Wright in the Q&A on your screen. Please include, if you would, in addition to your first name, your location. It's nice just to be able to share where you're from and asking your question. A little bit later, we'll get to questions from our audience this evening. As you mentioned, today being this anniversary of the day of the return of the Ayatollah, and this whole month is going to be this celebration of the anniversary of the revolution. Might that, the government observances here reignite protests? Is there any potential there for setting things off?
There is the potential for it, but I also think this is a moment that the government will pull out the rent-a-crowds and try to mobilize its supporters in a show of strength that the regime is still has legs. It does that every November 4th to mark the anniversary of the takeover of the U.S. Embassy, which is an event I covered, and I stood at the foot of the plane in Algiers when the 52 Americans flew to freedom. Every November 4th, they call it Pupils Day because they release students from school and bus them into in front of the old American embassy to say, you see that there's still strong antipathy toward the West and particularly the great Satan and so forth. But these are, I've been down there for the anniversaries, and I'm always struck by, the kids are off doing their own thing, talking to each other. The girls now wear lipstick and have black nail polish, that they do it because they're bussed in and it's a day off school and they can see their friends and mingle. And so I think the regime will try to mobilize as many as it can to get out and support. We all hope that the protests make a difference, because I think we've seen not only 2009 when it was over electoral fraud, but in 2017, there were very robust demonstrations over the price of egg and poultry. And in 2009, there was a sudden price hike in the cost of petrol. and there were protests that lasted weeks. With each round, the diversity of issues that people are protesting has grown. The segments of society who are getting out and protesting are different. So we've seen them over politics and election fraud. We've seen them over economic issues, and now we're seeing them over personal freedoms. And so this is where you get down to what percentage of support. For the first time in 2021, only 49% of voters turned out. The majority opted not to vote, and that's very telling.
What about the lack of leadership, though? When we think of successful revolutions, we can usually put a face to that, or faces. In this case, and again, because of communication, perhaps there are leaders, we're just not aware of them, but they seem very decentralized, and social media being inhibited because of the government crackdown, more difficult to bring them together. But is there much leadership? And if not, what would cultivate that?
I think there's extraordinary local leadership, but again, we don't have a name or an organization to put to give it. It's a little bit like the Arab Spring that spread across the Middle East in 2011, where you saw the young get out and protest, and they were unbelievably inspiring. They brought down 4 leaders, but in the end, they weren't mature enough or resourced enough to create an alternative, to have the kind of alternative to whether it was Mubarak or Gaddafi. They didn't have the political parties that could be alternatives in one-party states. And to some degree, we've seen that also in Iran, that we're talking about the average age of those arrested is, according to the government, under the age of 17. And so it's really hard when you're 16, 17 years old to, create a national movement, have a national leadership that's going to challenge a regime that has all the draconian tools. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards, the Basij paramilitary, the ordinary police, the riot forces, just so many layers of security and intimidation to use against its population.
Back in '79, at the time of the revolution, they had a leader in exile in Khomeini in France, and so he comes in, and then there's a new governmental system which takes the place of the monarchy, and in this case, there doesn't seem to be a particular form of government that those who would like to overthrow the theocracy have in mind. There's not agreement. And is that going to be an essential factor to avoid chaos if the government falls?
Well, let me just point out, in 1979, you had a variety of movements that were involved in the revolution. You had leftists and Marxists and nationalists and Islamists, and they united in looking for some means of an alternative under an Islamic banner, because the vast majority of people in Iran are Muslim, although they have an interesting Jewish population. And I've been to to synagogues in both Tehran and Shiraz. I've been to the Jewish school, the Jewish society, the Jewish hospital where the Ayatollahs love to go. So I've seen, and they have a Jewish member of parliament, which is always kind of striking. It's in the Constitution. But what happened was, when all these parties got together under the rubric of Khomeini, because he knew how to use technology, in those days, the fax machine and the tape cassette.
How times have changed.
Yeah, exactly. And so in that period after the revolution, there was this big debate about what was the alternative system, and they had to write a new constitution and have elections and so forth. And in the early days, you had secular leadership emerge, technocrats and so forth. But there was such a division over what the constitution looked like, and such squabbling, that many of the factions fell out against each other and started killing each other and opposing each other. And when it came time to decide on a constitution, many of the secular parties called on boycotts. So when the clerics developed a constitution that had not only the kind of traditional layers of executive, judiciary, and legislative branches. It then had parallel institutions in which the clerics dominated. So you have a supreme leader and a president. You have the Guardian Council and a parliament. You have the Revolutionary Guards or the Revolutionary Courts and the civil and criminal courts, and they're all kind of rivals for power. So when that was presented as a constitution, many of the secular parties didn't vote, and so that version of the Constitution won support. And so this is the question: how do you get to a point that there is an organization that mobilizes enough people where there's an agreement? I think one of the things that about the current protests is that they're over personal freedoms, and it's not about what is the alternative political system. And it's people who have come from diverse perspectives, who just want to be the ones to decide for themselves how they dress and what movies they see. And this is, it's a whole, what books they can read. And so it's a very different dynamic. And I think that is the challenge in this environment, to come up with a leader, a structure, and so forth. There are a lot of ideas out there, and particularly among the diaspora. There are those who support the return of the monarchy. There are those who support a group that used to be aligned with Saddam Hussein in Iraq, now is based in Paris. That is a kind of Islamist Marxist cult. I mean, there's a huge spectrum of ideas, and there's not unanimity among the diaspora either about what the alternative might be. And so, we're in this kind of twilight zone of trying to figure out what's next.
Well, and on the monarchy, isn't there support? Is it the grandson of the Shah that has support from some in the diaspora community?
It's the son of the Shah.
Or son of the Shah, excuse me.
Yeah. And Reza Pahlavi, who lives just, I live in Washington, D.C. He just lives a few miles away. I had dinner with him once, many years ago. And so, this is where it's unclear where the political sympathies of those inside Iran are right now. And I suspect there's a diversity. I mean, to me, I'm always struck about the vibrancy of Iranian society. And that although we in the West kind of look at Iran in terms of its government and its clerics and its brutality, that within society, there is an energy and a dynamism to debate about ideas, a discussion. I always find it fascinating to be there. And I've done every country in the Middle East.
Wow, amazing. The economy we talked about earlier, to what extent have US and other countries' sanctions on Iran contributed to the economic problems they face now?
So at the moment, the United States is the only party that has sweeping sanctions on Iran. After the nuclear deal was agreed to in 2015 and implemented in 2016, the UN lifted sanctions and many other Western countries lifted sanctions. And that's been a problem for the United States. Even though we're have extraordinary leverage, Iran has still managed to sell more than 1 million barrels a day of oil. At its peak, it could sell over 3 million. But the fact that it's still selling over 1 million despite sanctions has allowed the regime to survive. It's been tough. Ayatollah Khamenei said just this week that Iran was a decade behind because of sanctions as well as government mismanagement. The government corruption is extraordinary. It's endemic, far worse than it was under the Shah. The mismanagement of the economy is mind-boggling. During Ahmadinejad, he was giving loans that were under the rate of inflation. I mean, just nonsensical. He built public housing projects that didn't have sewage systems and didn't have running water. The running water didn't work, and they were just people weren't able to live. And when the population is soaring and there's no place to live, that's a problem.
Do these cases get prosecuted by the government?
Of corruption?
Yes. Yeah.
No, they get away with it, and some of the clerics are the worst offenders. And some of the offspring of the clerics are some of the worst offenders. I mean, there are famous cases of the kids of very famous very religious Ayatollahs driving Ferraris and driving them drunk and getting in terrible accidents and so forth. Again, we have kind of a stereotypical image, particularly from the United States, when a lot has happened over those 44 years with different generations.
Let's talk about the state of the nuclear deal. 2015, it struck. 2018, the U.S. withdraws under former President Trump's leadership. Where are we at now with the potential for a reinstatement of that agreement?
So President Biden said during the campaign that he was going to return to the nuclear deal, like he said with the Paris Climate Agreement. But the problem is, after President Trump withdrew from the deal, the Iranians, facing more pressure because Trump also reimposed sanctions, Iran countered with its own maximum pressure campaign and began breaching its obligations under the nuclear deal. And so we are at a point today that Iran is just days away from having enough enriched uranium to fuel a nuclear bomb. The outgoing chief of the Israeli Defense Forces said last month that Iran had enough fuel to enriched uranium to fuel 4 bombs, 3 at 20% and 1 at 60%. Now, this is more than you want to know, but the formal rate for enriched uranium to build a bomb is 90%, but you need greater quantities at lower enriched uranium. Now, that doesn't mean Iran's going to get a bomb in a few days, because there are other steps that are involved. You have to take the fuel, make the bomb, marry it to a warhead, and then miniaturize it and put it in a delivery system. And that's anywhere from several months to 2 years away. So we're not, and the CIA and Israeli intelligence and many others who are more conversive on where Iran's program is in the intelligence community say that Iran has not made the decision politically to cross the nuclear threshold, because it knows the minute it does that the dangers of military operation not only escalate, but become almost certain. So several months of negotiations held largely in Vienna to try to get back to the nuclear deal failed. In August, they came very close. The Europeans proposed a deal that was accepted by all 6 major powers, including the Russian and the Chinese. And the Iranians balked at the last minute and said, we want to bring some old issues in that were unrelated to the nuclear deal, that have to do with its program before 2003. And the whole world said, no way. And so we have been in a stalemate. And the reality is that we're at such a point that the terms of the deal, because there are sunset clauses that have expiration dates, and one of them is in October this year, that the idea of diplomacy getting us back to a point that we can contain Iran's program like we could have done in 2015 and 16 becomes a moot point.
To what extent is Russia providing material for the nuclear program of Iran?
We don't think that it has been a player at all. Iran's nuclear program really had closer affiliation with the North Koreans and the Pakistanis. And so the real danger is the other way around, what the Iranians are providing the Russians. And
for the war in Ukraine. Exactly.
And Iran's drones have made a huge difference, because those drones, which they started providing the Russians started using in September, have done significant damage to Ukraine's infrastructure, killed hundreds of innocent civilians. And now there is a real worry in Washington, according to my sources at the Pentagon, about Iran providing ballistic missiles to Russia, which again would add a whole new component to the war. And I hope you asked me about missiles, because in some ways, Iran's missile program is even more dangerous than its nuclear program.
Yes, well, please elaborate on that.
So a couple of years ago, I went across the Middle East, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Lebanon, and Qatar with the general, 4-star general who's head of Central Command, which runs all our operations in the Middle East and South Asia. And what he kind of help me understand is that Iran has reached something called overmatch. It's created such capability in missiles that it can fire more missiles than either the United States or Israel can deal with if it wanted to use, do a burst all at once. And what it's also done while developing its own capabilities, it has provided missiles to its allies in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, that have changed the political or the military balance of power on the ground in each of those countries. And it's, as one defense intelligence person told me, if you drew a circle around Iraq, a 700-kilometer circle around Iraq, and 700-kilometer circle around Syria, and 700 around Lebanon and around Yemen, you would find all these circles overlap. And in each of those countries, Iran has provided rockets and missiles. And Lebanon alone has somewhere between 130,000 and 150,000 rockets and missiles, all aimed at Israel. And so what Iran has also done is it's created its own new alliance in the region. Most major powers go out and they look for who can we ally with, who can be our allies. Iran has created its own NATO, and it is now the most significant military alliance in the Middle East. And that's what Israel is facing today, and so US allies as well.
What do you think of Israel's recent drone attack on that Iranian defense facility?
Well, the Israelis have not said they did it, but I have to say what the Israelis have done is stunning in terms of what they're allegedly supposed to have done, whether it's the assassinations inside Iran of its top nuclear scientists, its strike on its Stuxnet, the cyber attack that had such a devastating impact on Iran's nuclear program several years ago. It was kind of the beginning of the war we're seeing play out in cyber. And I suspect there's a lot more going on that we don't know. And the hit on Natanz nuclear facility, and now the latest. And what's so interesting about the new strike is that these were carried out by what are called quad choppers that lifted off from inside Iran. And so Israel's capabilities inside Iran are just extraordinary. And to carry out an operation, a covert operation where an Israeli team got inside Iran, got into the storage facility of its national archives on nuclear material, not only got them all out, and without any loss of life or anyone being caught. It's amazing. And for those of you who have not seen the Apple series Tehran, I highly recommend it because it really captures what's going on between Israel and Iran in captivating ways, partisan Hebrew, partisan English, and partisan Farsi. And I know what Tehran looks like. I know where certain graffiti is. I know all the sites, and it's captured Iran and the raves, as they're called, among the young. And how both countries have exploited dissidents within. It's fascinating.
Wow, I have to check that out. CIA Director William Burns was in Israel, I think it was last week. Secretary of State Blinken this week. We can guess what these meetings are about, but what is the potential here for further cooperation between Israel and the United States over the threat from Iran?
So I think the level of coordination is exceptional, and the U.S. and Israel carried out just last week the largest military exercises ever between the two countries, all aimed at understanding how they would operate in any military operation against Iran. And it was carried out by land, sea, and air, and involved over 100 U.S. warplanes, more than 40 Israeli warplanes, thousands of troops. It was very sophisticated. It played out over 5 days. I think at that level, whatever their differences among leaders, that when it comes to coordination, they are in sync.
And on Iran's alliance with Russia, is this really all about Syria, or are there other aspects that have brought these two countries to what we're told is the closest relationship they've had in the modern era?
Yes, well, in some ways, Iran and Russia are rivals in Syria, always have been. The Russians want to set up a military base. They want to be the kind of military strategists for Bashar Assad. The Iranians have their own mission to. I don't think they're crazy about Bashar Assad. He is not, of the same branch of Islam, and he is, he is socialist, and they have issues, but they need Syria because they want to help their Shiite brethren in Lebanon. And the geographic reality is that you have to have an ally in Damascus. And so Iran and its Hezbollah allies have played a major role in trying to be the military strategists for Assad as well, to have that leverage over him. I think that the danger is that Tehran and Moscow have become real partners in this war in Ukraine. And I am involved in briefings at the White House, Pentagon, State Department every week. And the language that is being used for quotation about that partnership is very striking. And remember, Iran and Russia are not natural allies at all. The first crisis of the new United Nations was over Soviet occupation of northern Iran. And Truman issued his famous ultimatum to Joseph Stalin, get out or else. And this was the first crisis of the UN, and it was the seed that then spawned the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. So there was deep bitterness historically, because the Soviet Union bordered Iran for a long time, and that was it was a very sensitive border. And so there wasn't a lot of love lost in Tehran. And today it's very worrying that Russia is one of its closest, maybe its most important ally now.
Let's take some questions from our viewers, beginning with Roger asked, does Israel have the weaponry to attack Iran's subterranean nuclear facilities?
Oh, a very good question. And I think that's one that a lot of people in the outside world wonder about. With each attack, Iran has gone deep underground into the mountains, and there are questions about whether even US bunker buster bombs could destroy Iran's facilities. Iran's put its missiles underground too. There are, if you haven't seen them, there are incredible videos that they boast. They put out, the Iranians put out themselves, of these bunkers where you walk, the generals walk through miles and miles and miles of huge missiles stacked up on both sides. And they have gotten to the point that they can launch, and they show how they've automated it so they can get multiple missiles moving on these kind of rail cars. So they go up and arrive at the same time, and they go up. They don't have to shoot them one individually through a silo. They can get them multiple missiles going at once. And so to me, it's very worrisome. The Israelis seemed confident that they could make a difference. I don't know how much of a difference. And one of the big questions kind of long term is, will a military strike actually convince the clerics that they have to have a nuclear weapon because that's the only means of defense? They had abandoned, the revolutionaries had abandoned the Shah's nascent nuclear program, which he started in the 1970s, and they only renewed it after Saddam Hussein invaded and started using chemical weapons against Iranian forces. And so the Iranians decided they needed a nuclear capability as a deterrent, not necessarily for use. And one of the questions is, has all the tensions gotten us to a point, there's so much momentum and there's so much progress and so many advances that it becomes a kind of fait accompli, even if the clerics didn't intend to actually get to the point that it had the bomb. And so your question is a good one. And so it's not just the difference whether we can destroy Iran's various capabilities, because you don't just go in and hit an underground nuclear plant. You have to go in first and destroy the command and control structure, the air defenses. You have to do so. Any operation would be incredibly complex. And to what degree would then Iran's allies, this NATO alliance it's built in the Middle East, then start attacking Israel, so that Israel would be fighting multiple wars, or on a war on multiple fronts. And this is where, when we think about what a military operation would look like, I will warn you, having covered wars for over a half century in many parts of the world, that a war against Iran would be far more complicated than either Afghanistan or Iraq combined.
Oh my gosh. We have two viewer questions, very similar. I'll combine them. Steve asking, what do you think the West could do to support the Iranian resistance? And Lisa in Boise, Idaho asks how Americans could support Iranian women.
Yeah, those are hard questions. You'd think there'd be simple answers. The administration has lifted sanctions on any American company that wants to provide the technology needed to circumvent the censorship and the banishment of the access to the internet, so that Iranians could communicate with each other. What difference that would make, I'm not sure in terms of ousting the regime. Clearly, it's an important step in giving people access to freedom of expression, freedom of information, and access to, as I said, to communicate, make plans with each other. But it's, I think, limited in terms of its tangible political impact. In terms of supporting Iranian women, it's just, I wish I had an answer for you about what there is to do. One of the lessons of US foreign policy is that in 1953, when Iran's first democratically elected government nationalized oil, which was basically run by, dominated by British companies, the MI6 and the CIA orchestrated, and anyway, the Shah fled under pressure, and from this, the movement. And 1953, the CIA and British intelligence mobilized a kind of their own rent-a-crowd, ignited unrest, and forced the democratic elected prime minister out of power and allowed the Shah to return to the throne. And there is a deep sense of suspicion about the United States. And the reason the embassy was taken over in 1979 was because the US admitted the Shah, the ailing Shah, into the United States for medical treatment. But many of the young Iranians at the time believed that this was the first step in putting the Shah back on the throne again. And so the kids intended to take over the US embassy for 3 days, and it turned into 444 days. I've interviewed all the three student masterminds of the takeover of the US embassy. So I've seen it both because I had friends who were hostages, still are my friends, and I was involved in covering it. And as I said, being there when they were freed. But I've also been to try to understand why it happened, why the Iranians are so suspicious. So one of the dangers for the United States in terms of our long-term interest in Iran is what role we play visibly in kind of deciding or dictating who should be in power. We can condemn all the time, and which both Biden and Trump have done, the regime, and earlier presidents criticized them, sanctioned them, and so forth. And Biden has imposed a lot of sanctions as well. So it's not just President Trump. But it would be, I think, dangerous for us to try to decide who is the alternative. What is the alternative system? We all want to see a democracy flourish in any country around the world. The question is, how do you do that in a way that is credible and legitimate long-term in the eyes of the people who live there? And that's been a challenge for the United States foreign policy as long as I've lived.
Carol asks, has the morality police truly been disbanded?
I mean, this is the propaganda line from the regime. I suspect, and I'm not there. I used to go to Iran at least once a year. It's now too dangerous for me to go. And I suspect they have told them to lie low. They've basically relied on the Wright police and some of the paramilitary to do the crackdown. The morality police, the clerics have come out, the senior clerics, and have said various things. That one minute they'll say, oh yes, we respect personal freedoms. And the next minute they say hijab or head covering is part of Sharia and must be honored by all women. So they speak from both sides of their mouth. The morality police have been used in varying degrees and varying ways at various times. So at the moment, I think that they're probably less visible. Have they been formally disbanded? I have my doubts. I suspect if they have, they've just incorporated these guys in different units, but with some of the same functions probably.
Eric asks, what's the relationship between China and Iran?
Very good question, and an important one, because China has facilitated the regime economically. Without Iran's ability to sell oil to China, the revolution would be in real existential challenges. It is already engaged in what it calls a resistance economy, where it's trying to resist international pressures. But China buying so much oil, and the irony is that both the Russians and the Iranians, under U.S. sanctions, are now selling discounted oil to China, and they're competitors when it comes to selling to the Chinese market. So the Chinese are sitting pretty when it comes, as they're developing their economy, their industries are sitting pretty in terms of access to energy sources.
You mentioned about it not being safe for you to travel to Iran, and I was reading that essentially no one's going to Iran right now, and that also is a significant part of their economic crisis that they're going through. And do you expect that's going to continue as long as you have protests and the government crackdowns?
Yes, tourism is actually an important source of income. And while I'm always struck one of the first things I do when I go to Iran is go down to Khomeini's mausoleum. And see how many Iranians are actually down there. How many are still kind of engaged, still admiring the revolutionary leader. And what I'm always often struck with is there are more tourists down there than there are Iranians. And I've actually met Americans who are as tourists who are at Khomeini's tomb. That's part of kind of the show and tell. And I think that is really, I think between COVID, cutting off tourism, and the protests, that the tourism industry has really dried up. I doubt completely, because there are still people who think it's exotic and interesting to go there. But I think that's another significant hit.
Jim asks, did former President Trump leaving the nuclear deal lead to the destabilization of the region?
Destabilization of the region. That's a big question. What I worry about is related, but doesn't quite answer your question. I worry that as Iran makes nuclear advances, that there are countries, most notably Saudi Arabia, that will say, well, we want a nuclear program too. I mean, it already wants nuclear energy, but does it want a nuclear weapon? And this is where the Pakistanis would be an important resource for Saudi Arabia, where you see that alliance among Sunni nations, Sunni Muslim nations, that's very worrisome. And so I worry not just about what Iran might do if it got a bomb or got a capability, is what it would do to proliferation. In some ways, whatever you think of the deep imperfections in the nuclear deal, it was still the most significant nuclear agreement in more than a quarter century anywhere on Earth. And one of the problems with the withdrawal from the deal is that it began to reflect, and I've written about this, how the fabric of arms control when it comes to nuclear weapons has not only begun to fray, it's begun to really unravel. And there are, our nuclear agreements with Russia have either been, abandoned or outdated by both countries. That when you look at, we kind of take for granted that there will be 9 nuclear powers and that's it, right? And there's a real danger that more kind of developing countries, emerging powers, get a nuclear weapon in ways that arms control deals between the major powers aren't enough to control them. And we're talking about not just big kind of Hiroshima bombs, but which are called strategic nuclear weapons. But we're talking about what's really the danger today are these smaller tactical nuclear weapons that don't have a 3,000 kilometer range, but have a 300-mile or 300-kilometer range. And this is where the Russians have an 8-to-1 advantage over the United States. And they have them all lined up, facing NATO allies. We were one and done. We used them once, we're never going to use them again. Whereas that was never part of Russian nuclear strategy. They've always continued to have designed where they put them, how many they make, and so forth. When we were walking away from tactical weapons, because Canada and Mexico are not threats to us, so why would we need tactical nuclear weapons? Whereas Russia does. And that's true of a lot of these other countries in the region or the developing world when they look at neighboring rivals. So I really worry about proliferation in ways that we as Americans just don't think about anymore.
We're just about out of time, Robin, and I'd like to give you an opportunity to just sort of sum up for us. And one of the things that we've talked about in these programs in recent weeks is how the NATO bond, the U.S. with its European allies, has become tighter as a result of the terrible attack by Russia on Ukraine and the devastation there. And maybe in closing, just sort of your thoughts on how all these developments, anything you see that is reason for optimism going forward.
So I'm a product of the baby boom and the post World War II generation. And I think one of the amazing things that we've seen are the creation of institutions and kind of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that there are certain principles that everyone in the world, because there is a certain level of education and knowledge, knows that they have rights. And that's why we've seen these protests in Iran, because the women are educated, because they have a sense of what's happened elsewhere in the world, and they want what they believe are their rights. So this is, again, if you look down the road at the human spirit, that for all the obstacles, for all the turns in the road, that there are certain ways in which every human being now knows what they have a right to in their lives. And I think that in terms of human history is really staggering. So there is reason for optimism. The question is, how do we get there? And how do we do it with institutions of the 21st century? And how do we do things in a way that help others achieve their rights rather than dictating what they should be? So I see hope in some of this. I'm inspired by the girls of Tehran.
Robin Wright, thank you so much. And I just have to say, I know you're very much immersed in what's happening right now, and the journalism you're doing right now is where your mind is fully at. But if there are ever times when you think back on all the reporting you've done over these years from all the places in the world, all the conflicts, all the developments, the complexities of those issues, the magnitude of that, I think for the rest of us looking at it is staggering. And I thank you so much, as do all of us with America at Crossroads, for being with us tonight and sharing all your experience, your wisdom, your expertise. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've enjoyed this very much. Thanks, Larry.
Appreciate it. Next week, we want to remind you that Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff of the Los Angeles area will be talking with the masterful Warren Olney of KCRW. The congressman's been making a fair amount of news over the past week. That's next Wednesday, as usual, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 o'clock Eastern. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And please make your contribution to support the America at a Crossroads series. You can do it on the website for either Jews United for Democracy and Justice or Community Advocates, Inc. The two organizations collaborate on these important programs every Wednesday. Please make your contribution to make sure that the programs continue. Thank you, and have a good rest of your evening.